Baruch Hashem, today's Daf Yomi is Chullin Daf Yud Ches, Chullin 18, but we're going to start on the bottom of Yud Zayin Obey 17b. Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara is discussing the concept of a pegima, a defect, a slight nick or a hole on a knife. In that context, it would make the knife disqualified to be used for shchita. So Amar Rav Huna bar Rav Katina Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Shalosh Pegimosim. This concept of pegimos, this pegima appears 3 times in halacha. Pegimas etzem bepesach. You're not allowed to break the bone of the Paschal lamb. So if you break the bone by a pegima, a small indentation, that's disqualifying. Pegima, that's a violation of the prohibition. Pegimas ozem bebechor. Now we know that there's an obligation to give your firstborn male animal to the Kohen, and the Kohen has to bring this as an offering. But if it has a blemish, you give it to the Kohen, and it is the money of the Kohen. He doesn't have to bring it as a carbon, but rather he can keep it. And so therefore the Kohen had an incentive to make, he wants it to be blemished because then he gets his own money. So if there's a defect on the ear of the firstborn, that's enough to allow it to become the mammon, the money of the Kohanim. And then we have the third case, Begimas mum bekodshim, that a hektish animal as designated for the Mizbeach cannot be redeemed unless it has a blemish. And what's a blemish? It's a size of a pegima. So Rav Chisda Amar Ap Pegima Sakir, Rav Chisda says also the pegima of a knife by Shlita. The idach, whereas the other opinion that didn't list this, the Chullin will kamari. We're not dealing with regular food. We're only dealing with kodshim food when I gave these examples. The kulan pegimasan in all these cases, the defect is kedei pegimas hamizbeach, enough to disqualify the altar. The kama pegimas hamizbeach. What is the pegima of the altar? Kedei shetachbor ba'tziporin. Enough if you run your fingernail over it, that'll get caught, it'll get nicked on it. Tosfos here asks, well, if that's the case, how do they build the altar? Because they're not allowed to cut out the stones with metal, and how do they get it so smooth? And Tosfos says either they could use the shamir that has other problems. The shamir is a special animal, but that also made it not smooth. So Tosfos says that they use small stones which they connected. It's very easy, much easier to find small stones. And Rambam says that they dug deep until they found the proper stones, deep into the ground. Meisvei, we say actually a contradiction because we had just said the pegima of the altar is enough to nick your nail on it. But Meisvei, kama pegima samizbeach. What is the pegima of the altar? Is Shem ben Yochai Omer tefach. It's a handbreadth. And Rebbe Lezer and Yaakov Omer kizayis. It's an olive size. So, and here we're saying it's a tziporin. So the Gemara says lokasha habasida haba'avne. Now, by stones, since it's pure, then it has to be even just a nail. But the sid is where you're connecting it with a compound, and so there is more cracks in it, so therefore it's a bigger shear. Amar Rav Huna, Hayta Bacha to Sar Sakina Kame Chacham. So, Boker Tov, good morning. So, this Tabach, this butcher, who did not show his knife to the Chacham. He didn't show his knife to the Chacham. We're on 18a, around 6 lines from the top. So, Mishamtinaway, such a Chacham who didn't show his knife, such a Tabach who didn't show his knife to the Chacham, we excommunicate him. The Rava Amar Mavrinaway, we don't not only excommunicate him, we remove him from his job. And we declare that his meat is non-kosher. They're actually not arguing. Rav Huna and Rav are not arguing. They're just talking about 2 different scenarios. If you discover the knife was good, he just didn't show it to a chacham, and we excommunicate him, but we don't declare his meat treif. We don't necessarily remove him from his job. But if we did not discover his knife to be okay, but meaning to say his knife was problematic, then we're going to say his meat is treif. Ravina Amar Hechadol Nimtzi Sakino says where you discovered that his knife was not good, Papyrsa. You ruin his meat with pirsa, which is like, it's like you ruin the meat by pouring some. Perish is pirsa. Rash says is perish, which is like the entrails or the feces, the junk of the animal. That's what you pour onto the meat to ruin it. That even a non-Jew won't buy it, so you ruin his meat, like you pour acid on it. There was a butcher. There was a butcher who didn't show his knife to Rava Bar Chinna Shamte. So Rava Bar Chinna excommunicated him. The Avre, and he also removed him from his post. The Achraz Abisre de Treifahi, and he declared that his meat was treif. Iklu Mar Zutra of Rav Ashi. So then Mar Zutra of Ashi came to see this butcher. They're going to the place. They're going to that place. So Amaru La'ainu Rabba B'milsa. He said to these students, he said, look into the matter because the Talube Tifle, because he's got kids who are relying upon him and he has to support them. So maybe look at the evidence again. Maybe we have to find a room to be lenient here, because the kids are dependent upon him. But Rav Ashi checked out the knife and so it was good. And he said the meat is kosher. He didn't remove the excommunication, but he said the meat is kosher. Don't you want to go back and ask Rabbi Bar Chinna? No, he put me in here. I'm his agent, and he told me, he gave me the authority. Let's say you have a tooth and you sharpened it, or you have a nail and it's very sharp, you're allowed to slaughter with it. But then we learn in the Mishnah, but then we say in the Mishnah just now that you can't slaughter with a tooth because it pulls instead of slicing. So it says, no, the Shein is not a question, because one is where you did it with one tooth, that's just sharp, that's okay. But if you do it with two, then there's a gap between the teeth, and that's a pagima, and that'll pull it. And tziporin will kasha, and also nails on nails is not a difficulty. One is where the nail is still connected to the animal, and so then you're not allowed to slaughter with something that's connected, because that could cause drasa. But if it's removed, it'll be okay. Now up to the next Mishnah. Hashochet b'magal tzir. Now let's say you slaughter with a sickle. And Rashi says that if you take this in one direction, it doesn't tear, because all the points are going in the same direction. So Hashochet b'magal tzir b'derech ha'cholichasa Beishamai posam. Beishamai say no, it's still a problem. Either because he thinks it does tear, or else maybe you flip it over. But it's all machshirin. It still says it's kosher under those circumstances, because it's not going to tear if you go only in that one direction. But if you smooth it out, if you smooth it out, it's okay. It's like a knife. So Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan has a chiddush. Even when Beis Hillel said, if you do it all in that one direction, it's okay. Well, they didn't really say it's kosher to mean you could eat it. What they meant is to say it's no longer considered a carcass. Remember, a carcass that just dies, it's just a dead animal, that transmits tumah. But if it's slaughtered properly and you discover the animal to have a defect, that's called a treifa, and that doesn't transmit tumah. So when Beis Hillel says it's kosher, he doesn't mean you could eat it, but he says it means it's not a nevela. But it's still prohibited to eat. So Amar Ashi, Dekanami Dekatani Beishamai Poson Beis Hillel Machshirin. And we can infer this reading because Beis Shammai says disqualified. Beis Hillel says it's kosher. V'okatani Beis Shammai Oshon Beis Hillel Matirin. Doesn't say Beis Hillel allows it. So it just means it's not, doesn't transmit tumah. The stomach of the Gemara has a problem with this. According to your logic, it should say tahor, not poslin umachshirin, el poslin umachshirin va'osin umatirin chadam milsehi. So we say that actually it means the same thing, and so we're going to say that the stomach of the Gemara rejects Rabbi Yochanan and says that according to Beis Hillel, you could even eat it. So now we're up to the next Mishnah, and now we're going to the issue of Hagrama. We know that there are 5 psuei shlita, 5 things that disqualify the shlita. One of them is called Hagrama. It's Shehi Adrasa Chalada Hagrama Ikur. Hagrama deals with where you slaughter outside the area where you're allowed to slaughter. Now, my Gemara, I'm using the Masifta Shas. I have a beautiful diagram that shows the trachea, and on the trachea are these rings, which are basically cartilage, and then there's a top ring, which is called the Tabat Hagedola, which is the very, very top ring, and then on top of that, there's something called, looks like a hat, and it's called kova. It's called the hat of the trachea. So the tabat hagedola is where the ring, the cartilage, goes all the way around the trachea, and the other tabaut, the other cartilage rings, the ring doesn't go all the way around. It goes most of the way around. It doesn't go completely around. So now it's in this context, let's go to the Mishnah. Hashochet mitocha tabas. So what this means is you shecht in the top ring, in the ring itself, which goes all the way around. And there's no ring above it. Vishir ba malechut al pnei kula, and you left a strand of the cartilage going around completely. Then we're going to say, according to the Rabbanon, shlita sok shera, and then it's kosher because and Rashi explains beautifully that you did not take the knife outside of that ring and go up to the head to finish it. Meaning that you did everything there. You did everything in that ring and you cut the whole thing. And then we're going to say it's kosher under those circumstances. But Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, Malechut al pnei ruba. You don't need to slaughter the whole thing. You just have to slaughter the majority of that ring. So he says, Koldu. Aval im kodem shagamar, as Kula says, actually we're still reading Rabbanon's position. According to the Rabbanon, if before you cut the entire ring on the Tabat Sagadola, before you did that, you higrim esatzak and latzad arosh. You pushed the knife upwards, and it went outside of that top ring, and you finished the shechita above the tabas, not in the place of the shechita. That's called hagrama, which is the law from Moshe at Sinai. And even though and this is the key line which you're going to need for the next 2 days, even though you slaughtered the majority of the trachea, the makom shechita, even though you only need to slaughter the majority of a trachea in general. But let's say, even though you slaughtered the majority of the trachea in the proper place, nevertheless, the rabbi is disqualified in this circumstance because you continued on and you did more of it beyond the proper place. And so therefore it's disqualified. If you would have just stopped, it would have been okay. But you went on and you went outside, and that's a problem. So, but Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, Malechut al pnei ruba. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, you just have to leave, if you cut the majority inside the top ring, and then with the minority you went out of it, and you complete the shechita, it's kosher. Because Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, I'm reading Rashi, the beruba is kasher la shechita. As long as you have the majority, it's okay. And the rest, when you cut, it's like it's like you're just cutting a piece of meat in general, and it's not a problem. And so therefore, the Rabbanan say you need everything, and Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says you just need the majority. So, but that's on the tabas hagadola, the top tabas. But I'll say this now, so you're not confused when reading Gemara. If you cut with on the cartilage itself, on the other rings, that's no good because you need to cut in between the cartilage and those grooves. Okay, so that's what Rav and Shmuel are going to come and say. Rav and Shmuel Damar Travayu, halachic Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. That was that on the top ring, you only have to cut the majority. The Af Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, or Amar Al B'Tabas Hagadola. When do they say that it's okay if you slice the majority? Only by the top ring. Whole mukefes is kol akana, because it goes all the way around. So therefore, you could do shlita on it. Otherwise, you need to do it in between the rings, and that's what it says. Aval b'shar tapo is slow, but the other rings, and the way Rashi reads it, the other rings, if you cut the cartilage, it's no good. Look at Rashi at the bottom. Ain't shlitatzu kasher b'sochon klal ela bein tabas tabas. If you cut those other rings, it's no good at all. You have to cut in between the rings, because since they don't go all the way around, it's not considered the trachea, even though it goes around the majority of it. So the trachea is really underneath it. And so the top ring has the trachea because it goes all the way around, but the other rings are not the trachea. It's just in between the rings is the trachea. And you need to cut the trachea. Gemara says, Vatanya. So the Gemara says, Ubashar Tabo slow. You mean to say in the other rings it's no good. Vatanya, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, Omer. Doesn't he say, Hashochet b'shar tabos, if you slaughter the other rings, even though it doesn't go around the whole thing, since it goes around the majority, it's going to be kosher. Psula. And then the Brisa continues. And this is already not the question. The question was that from what we just said, he says you can do it because it's the majority. Umugremes psula. But if you, after you did that, you went out of the zone, then it's going to be disqualified, like the Rabbanan. So hey, Reb Chanina ben Toganus al Mugremes Shikshir. They say that Mugremes is kosher because his position is even if you go above the ring. So anyway, that's that he extends the zone to not just the Tabas Hagadola, but to the kova of the trachea. But anyway, we see from here that according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, you can slaughter on the rings. So I'm Rabbi Yossi, for Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Tarti Kamar. He said two halachos. One halacha was that if you slaughter the majority of the kana, it's kshera, even though you did the hagrama in the end. That's what we said in our Mishnah, because Rubo Kakulo. And he said another halacha, that the other tabos are considered like the kana because they go around. Rabbi Shmuel Savar Kavasa Bechadu Polyglot Bechadu. They agree with him that as long as you did the majority of the tabas hagadola, it's okay, but they don't agree with him that you could do the tabos in general. Mar says, "Valo Amri Kamar," but Rabbi and Shmuel, didn't they say also Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda? You only said his law by the tabas hagadola and not by the other tabas. The Gemara says, "Hachi Kamri." That this is what they're saying. Halacha kamoso b'tabas hagadola. We agree with him that if you do the majority by tabas hagadola, it's okay. They ain't halacha kamoso b'shar tabos, but we don't agree with him that if you slaughter the cartilage, you cut the cartilage of the other rings, that it's okay. We say that that is not shchita. So now we say kisalak Rabbi Zera achol mugremes to Rav Shmuel. When Rabbi Zera went up from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, he ate this mugremes of Rav Shmuel, like Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says that if you cut the majority and then you went out of the zone, it's okay, but not like the Rabbanan. So, excuse me. Rabbi Zera went up. He ate something that Rav and Shmuel said was disqualified, meaning to say in the other rings. He ate it even though it was slaughtered in the other rings, which Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda said would be okay, but Rav and Shmuel paskin like the Rabbanan that it's not okay. So Amalei Lavni Asri the Rav and Shmuel. Don't you come from the place of Rav and Shmuel? So it should be not okay. Amalei Man Amra. So he said to you, who said to you this law in the name of Rav and Shmuel that it's no good? Yosef Parchia. So they said to him, Yosef Parchia said it to him. So he said, Yosef Parchia Mikuli Almagamir. Yosef Parchia, he's not reliable. maybe he maybe didn't hear from Rav and Shmuel. So Shema Rav Yosef did not like this, obviously. Ikbid, he got upset. Amar Anami Kol Alma Gamirna, Anami Rav Yehuda Gamirna. He says, I didn't learn it from everybody. I learned it from Rav Yehuda. We know Rav Yehuda was a student of both Rav and Shmuel. That few Sveika the Gavigars and Rav Yehuda was so careful that he would even say if he was unsure. The Amar Rav Yehuda, and there's a proof of that. The Amar Rav Yehuda and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, that he said the following: Safek mishmei de Rav, Safek mishmei de Shmuel. He says, I'm not sure if I heard this from Rav or from Shmuel. That to allow the firstborn to be in, you need to prove that it's a blemish. You can either use, you're supposed to use an expert, but if you don't have an expert, like we saw Rav himself went to a field when he went down to Babylon. He stayed on the field for 6 months to learn movement. So you could that to say that if you don't have an expert, you can use Sholosh Hadyotos. Anyway, we see from here that Rabbi Yehuda was precise. Rabbi Zera, so Gemara says, even if he says like Rav and Shmuel, that even if he says that Rav and Shmuel actually don't disqualify if you do it straight on the cartilage, Nevertheless, since they already established this as a prohibition in the place where he was, he should have adopted the stringencies. He came from a place of Rav and Shmuel, and then he went to a place where it was also strict. So he should have been strict. So he says, Amar Abai, Hanimilim, Babel, Meretz Yisrael. Above all that, yeah, you have to adopt the stringencies if you go from Babylon to Babylon, from Eretz Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, or else you go from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Well, Bavel, Eretz Yisrael, but he says if you go from Babylon to the land of Israel, so I came from Babylon, but you guys are in the land of Israel. You guys are lenient, and so since we're subservient to you, I can adopt your leniencies, and so therefore I can eat. Even though Rav and Shmuel were strict about this, I can eat it. Ravashi Amar Afilu Tema Mibavel Eretz Yisrael. Ravashi says, even if you want to go from Babylon to Eretz Yisrael, you could say, even then, but even from Babylon to Eretz Yisrael, when do we say that you have to adopt the stringencies? Only where you have in mind to go back. But Rabbi Zera ain't died to Lachzor. Rabbi Zera wasn't going back, so he doesn't have to adopt the stringencies. And it makes sense, because can you imagine if everybody from Babylon went to Eretz Yisrael, they would still keep their Babylonian practices? When they went to the base of Mikdash, they say, no, in Bavel, we did it like this. No, if you're not going back, you should adopt the leniencies of the place you go to, or their stringencies. Amar Abai Rav Yosef, but those rabbis who came from Mechuzah, they said that they held like Rav and Shmuel that this stringency. So the Gemara answers, Amarle, Nahara Pashta. Yeah, there was many different places in Babylon. Not everybody held the same thing in Babylon. So we saw earlier that Rabbi Chanina ben Antagonist said Mugremis is Kshera. According to him, it's a law of Moshe Mitzina. He obviously is not saying that Hagrama is Kshera, because Hagrama is a law from Moshe at Sinai. So he's saying it doesn't mean in the top ring, because his position is even on top of the top ring is what's called the Kova. That's still the Makom Mashchita. So therefore, he says if you went up to there, that's not going to be disqualifying. So Reish Lakish Achsher Bechuda de Kova. He says even if you went all the way up to the top of that Kova, and he said even if you went up to the top of that Kova, on top of the trachea, that's still okay. Karile Rabbi Yochanan Gisa. Either so Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were brothers-in-law. So either he's saying to him, my brother-in-law, what are you doing? Or else he was saying, too much. Amar Papish made the Rava Paga Bachiti Trefa. Then on top of that Kova, there's this cartilage, which I guess looks a little bit like a kernel. So therefore they say, Rav Papi said in the name of Rava that if you touch that, that's too far. That's trefa. You buy a little pagav and nagaban. So dama paga below naga. Does it mean you actually touch it, or you just came right before it? Because it says vayifka bo malachei elokim when the angels met Jacob and they escorted him. So in Papa Mishmei de Rava, he says shir bechite shir. As long as you didn't touch the strings, these cartilage strands are kosher. And Amar Hamemer bar Mar Yanuka. And the Kamina Kamei de Rabbi Chia Brei de Rabbi Avi. The Amar shir bechite shera. That if you left this part over, it's kosher. Amarle Ravino Ravashi Amarle Rav Shimon Misuvra Ikla Marzutra Achim Midar Shir B'chitek Shir. That as long as you didn't touch this these cartilage strands, it's kosher. Mar Ravashi Amar Paga B'chiti mean to say as long as you just came up to it, but you didn't cut them kshera. But if Shir B'chiti, but let's say you cut them into two treifa, then it's going to be treifa. So we see from Mar Baravashi that paga means that you touch them. That's shir b'chiti. But if you didn't touch them, it's kshera. So, okay. The Ilchasa and the halacha is mishifay kofa ulamata kshera. From the slant of this upper hat above the trachea, from the part where it starts to get narrow, that's going to be kosher. V'hainu de shir b'chiti, and that's what it means when they say shir b'chiti. Okay, and we have to stop here. But Baruch Hashem, we have a beautiful daf today, and tomorrow's daf is also beautiful. Shkoyach.
Thank you.